All right, I think we've started. Hello, I'm Panio Giannopoulos, editorial director of the Next Big Idea Club. I'm here today with Paul Bloom, whose newest book, The Sweet Spot, The Pleasures of Suffering and the Search for Meaning, is one of our official Next Big Idea Club selections. I'm gonna hold it up right here. Oh, can you see it? It's getting blurred out. Let me bring it real close. This is Zoom's fault. Aaron, it's a great image, by the way, the sort of Sisyphean
I was very happy
on the
with it
front.
when they did that, when our director thought it. That was very clever.
There's an interesting aside about Sisyphus, maybe we'll get to later. I'm a big Greek myths fan, so I found something kind of fascinating about his story. So Paul, you're a professor of psychology at University of Toronto. You've written a number of books, and this latest one, I feel like all of your books have a tendency to sort of surprise, and you'll sort of have unexpected arguments, like Against Empathy, which was a book before, which I also loved. They're kind of provocative, I think, but they're also, heavily researched. And so to me, it seems like the big argument you're making here, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that pain and suffering are essential to happiness. And so even though there's this fantasy of like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could just, solve all my problems, that in fact, that wouldn't make me happy at all. And a good life involves more than pleasure. So maybe you could talk about this sort of fundamental argument.
No, that's exactly right. It's funny because my last book before this was called Against Empathy, and it argued that empathy is a poor moral guide. And man, people hated that book. Like, some people liked it. It did well. People read it, a lot of discussion. Yeah, I hated that book. So one thing about The Sweet Spot is people don't seem to hate it. They like it, they don't like it, they disagree. But I don't get hate mails, no death threats, and everything like that. And the idea is, like you say, it's I'm interested in human behaviors and desires are kind of hard to explain. So, it's not hard to explain why we like sex and good food and love and company and feeling fine. Those are sort of, any common sense evolution just tells you this is what we should aspire to. But I was really interested in why we seek out pain and suffering. And as I worked on the book, I started being interested in the idea of pain and suffering and difficulty as a source of pleasure. And then I sort of began to explore the benefits it gives us more generally for satisfying other appetites. And so you're exactly right that the theme of the book is that pain and suffering and difficulty, that whole cluster of things you might think we'd want to avoid, actually we seek out, and we seek out because they satisfy certain goals. And then the other thing I argue, which sort of follows from the first thing, is a fact about human nature, which is what I've called motivational pluralism. And the idea is that we don't just want one thing. We want many things. We want pleasure, like a lot of people will tell you, but we also want to be good. We want to be moral. We want to be seek out meaning and purpose, have transcendent experience, have variety. And for each and every one of these goals, pain and suffering play some are mechanisms for us to get there.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay, that's really interesting. So my question is the drive towards pain, or the attraction towards pain, is that purely unconscious, or is that a conscious thing that we do?
That's a really good question. I think it's both. I think to some extent we do it instinctively. We know it without knowing we know it. I think anybody who's had a sprained ankle will kind of press on it a bit. And if you say to somebody, you want to see something disgusting, they'll usually say, yeah. And and we do these things. Children like to be afraid in the right doses. They like, and they don't contemplate it. So a large part of it can be unconscious. By the time you're an adult, and if you're halfway reflective, you kind of get some idea of what you like. You know what you like. So you go to the Indian restaurant and say, give me the hottest thing you got on the menu. And there you know what you're doing for. You look for horror movies, and if they say this is really unbelievably scary, you want to go there. You might seek out sexual partners who will engage in various forms of painful sex play. So it's unconscious, kind of humming beneath the surface, I think, but also we also know about it, and then kind of consciously and directly seek it out.
So how do we kind of navigate that spectrum, though? Because I'm sure at a point, too much pain is just destructive, and that doesn't cause any pleasure.
Yeah. So my book is a case for chosen suffering, and there's some qualifications here. Not all forms of chosen suffering are good. One thing I talk about is, say, adolescents who cut themselves, And I think there it's often a cry for help. It's often
Mhm.
it's a sign that things aren't going well. And another case which I don't talk about in my book is eating disorders, which often I think often the idea is it's exerting control over your body. And this is sort of control I'm fond of when we talk about athletic pursuits and intellectual pursuits and so on. But it's not, in the case of eating disorders, plainly dysfunctional, it could kill you. So in that way, it could be a mistake. And then individually, I think we all find our level. I call the book Sweet Spot for a few reasons. And this is one of them, actually, which is people like spicy foods. Many people like to be afraid. Many people like to mull over sad things. But we all have our spot where there's some things that's just too much. And there's some things which is not enough. And so much of life is trying to find difficulty and struggle that's at the right intermediate level. And one specific thing which is really cool, which is the idea of flow. And I like the idea of flow. This is Csikszentmihalyi's idea of experiences where you lose yourself. And he said just what you're saying now, which is flow sits within a sweet spot. In order to find yourself in a flow experience, you're a rock climber, you're a musician, you're a writer. It can be too easy, then you get bored. But if it's too difficult, it leads to anxiety and worries about failure, and you tune out. So you have to find this in-between space.
Right. And there's a sort of blur between difficulty and pain there, I guess, right? It's funny, when I think of flow, I wouldn't think of pain as being a part of that experience.
That's right. I wish there was an English word for what I'm talking about through the book. I use the word suffering, and it's close enough.
Yeah.
But what I'm really interested in, why do we seek out experiences we would normally avoid, aversive experiences? So this could include real pain, which we seek that out. It could include suffering, could include emotional distress. It could simply include difficulty or the exertion of effort. And these are all puzzles. Psychologists talk about the principle of least effort, which says animals try to do the least effort possible. If you're a dog and you're chasing something, you're heading in one direction, you go straight there. You don't run around 10 times before you get there. If I'm reaching for my cup, I'm going to reach for my cup. I'm not going to leave the room, come back, then pick up my cup. So we like the least amount of effort, except when we don't, except when we choose to go for a run or choose to do a crossword puzzle or choose to engage in, because we just like the work. So crossword puzzles are, you wouldn't call it pain, you wouldn't call it suffering, but it is voluntary effort that's not going to get you any mates. Believe me, this is my crossword puzzle acumen does not kill the dating scene when I was younger. It's not going to get you any dates. It's not going to increase your survival and reproduction. And if you're like me, you're not even that good at it. But the effort is good. And I never met anybody who didn't appreciate some degree of effort towards a goal.
Right. I mean, just to get a little pop culture, I don't know how to avoid this, but there's that great moment in The Matrix, the first movie, where they talk about how the original simulation they created, everybody was happy, everybody was sort of effort free, and they rejected it. That didn't feel real to them. So that always stuck me. I thought that was a really clever.
That. I quote that in my book as the best origin story. Where Agent Smith, that your primitive minds couldn't take it. They couldn't take paradise. And you see the same story reliving itself over and over again in different guises. So I tell this thing from the pre-Matrix, from the Twilight Zone, and it's a story of this mobster, and a violent mobster. He dies, and then to his surprise, he wakes up in what seems to be heaven. He's in this hotel suite, anything he wants, sex, wonderful food, conquest over his enemy. He just gets, and everything is easy, and he starts to go mad. And then finally he says to his spirit guide, look, I don't belong in heaven. I belong in the other place. And the spirit guide says, this is the other place. If there's to be a heaven, it will involve failure and pain and struggle, because without that, there's nothing good.
Wow. Yeah. That's a great story.
Like, when we play games, we like to win. But who would want to play if there was no possibility of losing? And every thought immediately makes me bored.
Well, and there are video games too, where I like to play games, and once you hit a certain level of ability, you stop playing the game because it's just not fun anymore.
Yes. And the video games actually are a wonderful illustration of what you said before, which is the best games captured a sort of sweet spot. So think of, first-person shooter you're going through, you die. You typically go back to some earlier point. If you had to redo the whole game all over again, you wouldn't play it more than once. On the other hand, they often plug in something where you're penalized. You have to go back to a spot.
Right.
And so it's interesting. And so much of our entertainments and pleasures, movies, stories, involve playing with the balance between pleasure and pain.
So Adam Grant had a great blurb for your book. He called it an exhilarating antidote to toxic positivity.
Yeah.
So maybe how can somebody use sort of your perspective when dealing with toxic positivity?
So that was a very kind blurb, and the toxic positivity, one way of putting it, is just the simple idea, which is simple, it's popular, and I think it's false, that people just want pleasure and they just want happiness. And it's not that wrong. People do want pleasure, they do want to be happy, but it's not all they want. They want other things, and sometimes the other things are in contrast with the more hedonic goals. And then the question is, how do you get it? How do you live the best possible life? And I'm not the kind of guy to tell you that, but what I would say is there's a lot of support for the idea that people think a full and satisfying life involves exploring, not just trying to be happy. In fact, trying to be happy is kind of a bummer. There's a robust correlation between people who say they really want to be happy and take happiness important, and people who are sad. Now, this could go both ways. You could be critical. You say, well, sad people want to be happy. That's why you get the correlation. But there's some evidence that seeking happiness kind of sucks. And the advice you get, and this is advice long before me, sort of common sense advice, is seek out deeper goods, difficult projects, moral goals, transcendent goals. Happiness will come to you kind of as a byproduct. And maybe, and if it doesn't, you might be just as satisfied. There's a line attributed to Freud, and he didn't actually say it, but it's attributed to him, where he said the two signs of mental health are love and work. And by love, you could take that to mean relationships and intimacy more generally. And work, you mean difficult projects. And I think that there's a true wisdom there, that exploring those two things is what makes people happy and what makes people having fulfilling lives more than that.
Right. And so when we think about something like toxic positivity, is it this idea that you're trying to, I guess the way I interpreted it is that it's kind of a superficial pursuit of happiness, right? It's
That's right.
It's all the sort of top level stuff as opposed to the kind of deeper, more meaning based pursuits.
Right. And in fact, in support of that way of looking at it, there's some recent findings saying that if Americans tell you they want to be happy, they tend to be miserable. If people from Asia tell you they want to be happy, they often become happy. And the theory that goes on with it from subsequent studies is Americans have the wrong idea of what makes you happy. So they seek out status and money, which isn't bad. It does give you a boost, but the seeking it out is kind of mind-numbing a little bit. While people from more collectivist societies have a better theory, which is the theory says, well, I want to be happy, so I'm going to spend a lot of time with my friends. I'm going to spend a lot of time with people I love. It turns out that way of being happy actually works better. It's a better route. So right. So sometimes, and I think if you want to be happy, sometimes you say, well, the natural tendency, and Csikszentmihalyi and I talked a lot about this, the natural tendency, if you want to be happy, is to kind of plop on the sofa, open up a beer, and watch Netflix. It is an extremely natural human inclination to just let the body relax and do things. But the problem is you should instead go out for a run or get together with some people or do something that poses some difficulty in your way. It will be harder at first. It is always harder to start something, but in the end, the overall sort of dynamic of your ups and downs will be better if you take the effort first to sort of get off the sofa, metaphorically.
Right. Yeah, that motivational sort of inertia is hard to break. I mean, because I do feel like we intellectually know that, but in the moment, it's hard.
Every night, my partner and I sit in front of TV and watch like an episode of TV or something, some sort of series we're watching and so on. Yeah. Well, sometimes we have a nice drink, and I'm not denying that's really nice. Would we be happy? But sometimes we play chess, or we go for a walk, or we have, and we're always happier when we do something else besides that. But it's hard not to do that. It's you know,
it is hard.
It is hard. And, you know, the evidence, Csikszentmihalyi talks to people in his work and asks, how much of your life is spent in a flow state where you're totally immersed in this difficult activity? And he studies people who will give you an answer like, most of it. I spend most of my life fully engaged with something. And then he finds a lot of people say, nothing, 0%. I am never in that. Now, sometimes it's choice. Sometimes it's circumstance. If you have 2 young children running underfoot and a job that just involves responding to things right away, it's very hard to find a flow state. So, you know, I think we have to acknowledge that some of the things we're talking about, everybody who writes books about this thing, talking about, usually rely on, it's easier to do it if you've got money. It's easier to do it if you have help. It's, you know, flow states are great if you're an athlete or a musician, harder to get it if you're working at McDonald's.
Yeah, that's true. And you do address that in the book. I mean, I feel like you're pretty careful about that. And you talk about, there was this one line which I thought was interesting because you were referencing, I don't think you call it the happiness crisis, but other people have, where, you know, there's this sort of rates of depression that are very high in affluent countries. And that seems counter to what you'd expect. You'd think if everyone's, you know, typically more well off, people would be happier. And you make a connection between, I guess, people in affluent countries are lacking in higher purpose, a lot of sort of statistically. But I wonder if it's also, if that's tied into struggle too. I mean, maybe if things are okay, you're not having that pain that gives your life meaning. It's sort of a kind of, there's a hole in the bucket. You don't even know that's what's doing it to you.
The country by country data is really cool because it pulls apart happiness and meaning in an interesting way. So, you know, the findings, there used to be this really counterintuitive finding that if the more money you make, the less happy you are. And people love that sort of stuff. Money doesn't make you happy. And then, you know, as we both know, when the studies are done right, more money you have, the happier you are. And why in the world not? You know, what money does is it buys you better food, nicer housing, more time with people you love, more freedom from all sorts of predation and cruelty. You know, you have enough money, you know, you're not stuck in a bad job, nobody can tell you what to do, and so on. And countries also show the pattern, which is the richer countries, for the most part, have the happier people. It's complicated, other factors played a role too, but money is a big predictor. And Gallup and all these polls, world value surveys, ask the countries how happy you are. And then 1 year, Gallup, just for the fun of it, asked people from like 165 countries, how much meaning and purpose do you have in your life? And Diener and Oishi, two happiness psychologists, really clever scholars, took that data and they looked at that data. And that data is the opposite. There's an inverse relationship between meaning and money. So the list of the top 10 countries for happiness, you know, whatever, they're Norway, Sweden, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, really nice places to live. The top 10 for meaning, and I don't remember the list, but there are places nobody wants to live. There are places I tell you, say, I might visit there one time, but, you know, I'll be careful. Because they're poor, they're often war-torn, and so on. But they have meaning, maxing out on meaning. And so the question is why? And one answer is your answer, which is the fact that they have to devote their lives to day-to-day struggle gives an importance to their daily activity. You know, if I finish my next book or not, well, that's nice, that's good, it satisfies certain things, I'm happy and everything like that. But my children won't starve to death. Either way, so it diminishes the importance of day-to-day activities. People in poor countries are more religious. Religion, I think, instills some sense of meaning. They have more children. Children instill a sense of meaning. But you really see them pulling apart in the ways you're talking about.
Yeah. I was wondering about the spiritual angle because there's certainly that connection to spirituality giving you a sense of purpose and meaning very often. And then also this idea that whatever pain you're suffering, say you believe in a God or a divine creature, you think that it's bestowed, it's sort of God testing you, right? That's a very different relationship to pain.
I think
to a painful event.
I think it is. So my book is in making a case for chosen suffering. You know, everything from crossword puzzles to running a marathon to having kids to all sorts of things. but I do talk about unchosen suffering, the bad stuff that happens to you.
Right.
You get cancer, somebody you love dies, you lose your job, your house burns down. And and I argue that actually this, I have quite a kind of hard boiled look at it. All this talk about post-traumatic growth and, oh my God, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I think the evidence for it is just that be nice if it were so, but bad things are just bad for you for the most part. We're often more resilient than people give people credit for. But bad events are bad. However, we are good storytellers when it comes to bad events. And often we tell stories where ultimately they're for some benefit. And one thing religion does more than anything else, and I have laboratory work comparing theists and atheists in their things, and my laboratory work finds what everybody else finds in general, which is that if you're religious, it's easier to tell a story about a bad thing that happened to you. If I, I'm an atheist, so if I go out and somebody, mugs me and I'm horribly injured, I say, wow, that was unlucky. That's my story. But if I'm religious, I could say, wow, well, I'm being tested. Or I might say, I'm being tested, or I might say, my suffering makes me more receptive to God. C.S. Lewis, wrote that when you're happy, God speaks to you in a whisper, but when you're miserable, you hear God shout. And it's a common idea. Some Christians believe that their pain is in some way an acknowledgement and a sort of a recapitulation of Christ's pain on the cross. Buddhists, say, life is suffering. It just is what it is, and and your experience of suffering is just your normal, natural state. Religions have these stories, and people find these stories very reassuring. I mean, the sentence that sums it up for everybody is everything happens for a reason, and even atheists believe that to some extent. If you just even do what we did, we asked them, but religious people believe it. And so religion, when it comes to unchosen suffering, can provide a source of structure, a source of validation.
Well, so to talk a little bit more about chosen suffering, you have the term benign masochism.
Yeah.
Which that's a very catchy term. It sounds like a band I'd go see.
It's not mine. I wish it was mine.
Paul
Rossman's an 80-year-old psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, who's the sharpest guy you'll ever talk to. And he thought of benign masochism.
So and you say that certain conditions have to be met to qualify as benign masochism. So can you share those conditions and why those are necessary?
Yeah, so a lot of my book is about the role of suffering for a meaningful life and purpose and morality. But the first part, I talk about how we use suffering to have fun. And this is benign masochism. So the circumstances for benign masochism has to be chosen, always chosen. It has to involve the willing infliction on yourself, a willing infliction of some sort of pain or suffering onto yourself. There's a million examples of this. My friend Dan Gilbert once did a study where he had an electric shock machine, where for undergraduates at Harvard, if you press a button, you get this painful electric shock. And he did a lot of things with the shock machine. But the number one finding is you tell people I have a shock machine and they say, wow, can I try it? And you might think like, wait, it hurts. Yeah, I know. I know how it works. I know the idea. Then I try it. Can I lick it? And so it got to involve pain. And then finally, it got to be benign.
So it won't be damaging.
Right. So saunas are examples of benign masochism, but in a world sauna competition like 6 years ago, 2 guys went in and they raised the heat. I know there's a world sauna competition, which is how much heat can.
I'm sort of amazed there's a sauna competition. That sounds like the easiest competition in the world. You just sit in a hot bath, not a bath, but in a sauna.
Well, not anymore, because they don't really have them anymore because of what happened, I think in 2008. One guy ended up in a coma and somebody else died because they just fried themselves. That's not benign either. And there's all sorts of cases where in religious fervor or mental illness, where people do serious damage to their bodies, permanent, horrible damage. And that's not benign masochism. Benign masochism is the electric shock machine in my friend's office. It's chicken vindaloo. It's consensual spanking or whatever in sex. It's hot baths, it's saunas, it's running full out even though you're out of breath. It's that kind of thing. And we're all familiar with it. And it is a source of pleasure. And then I lay that out, and then I try to wrestle with the question, well, how's it a source of pleasure? These things sound
Right.
intrinsically bad.
Yeah.
And there's different answers. One answer is simply contrast, which is that the brain is a difference machine. We don't respond to things typically as they are in some absolute sense, but we respond to things in contrast to what they were. And one thing that pain could do, if you level up the pain and then you take it away, there's a sense of relief that could be blissful. So one of the joys of eating spicy food is you drink some beer, eat some yogurt, and then the burn goes away. One of the joys of running real hard is stopping. And it's all a joke my dad used to tell me, or told me a long time ago, about the guy banging his head against the wall. And he asked why he's doing that. He says, it feels so good when I stop. And that's that. So there's contrast.
Right.
And we see this, people going on long hikes. And some ingredient to this is you get back and then you're resting and it feels so good to have it done with, which is, I think, consciously something only humans do. There's feelings of mastery and control, which is, there's a real feeling of pride, of ability to put yourself in a painful situation or difficult experience and bear it. There's a feeling that runners talk about when you get to run really hard for long periods, and it feels really good to be able to do that. But you don't get the satisfaction unless it's hard, unless it's painful. There's escape from self. There's sort of a third ingredient, and that sounds really woo and not very coherent. But the idea is that, and I find this sort of interesting. I personally experienced this a few times, where sometimes this voice in the head, and we live in our heads a lot. We think about the past, we think about the future, we think about how other people are looking at us, how we're presenting ourselves. But when you're really caught up in something, particularly something difficult, often something painful, it takes your mind away from all of this. And for a short time, it does something to consciousness that makes it kind of wink out in a way that could be pleasurable. When kids are cutting themselves and they go through treatment and therapy, they're often told there's substitutes you could do, which don't damage your body, which you don't risk infection or mutilation. Simple one is just an elastic band on the wrist, and when you snap it, and the sudden pain jolts you. Another one, which has its own problems, but I think its own benefit, is intense exercise, where you're running full out, you're cycling full out, and then you just get out of your head. Getting out of your head is a good thing. So those are sort of different ways in which benign masochism could do its trick.
That's interesting. I spent a lot of my life training in martial arts, and one of the big appeals was when I would go on the mats and I would train, I wouldn't think about anything else for an hour. I mean, I guess it was a kind of flow, right? And then when it was over, all my problems would come rushing back, and all my whatever anxieties I might have.
BJJ or something?
I did I did a bunch of different arts, but my main art really was Taekwondo and Hapkido, but then I did some grappling and some BJJ, and I even did some stick fighting. I sort of just jumped around, tried everything, did some boxing. And but my favorite, no matter what,
you get flow, you get pain, you get the whole bit.
You do, no matter what art you're doing or whatever style, you cannot think of anything else. I mean, you literally can't. There's someone in front of you who will pretty much knock you out if you do. And I find that it's hard to find a non-physical thing that does that for you.
That's right. Some people, my son does bouldering, and he would tell you the same thing, because you're going up a little thing, and you're supporting your weight, and you're just focusing on the mountain. I tell the story early in the book. The first time I did BJJ, and I'm horribly out of shape, and this guy, like 20 years younger than me, and he's just twisting me into a pretzel for a couple of minutes, but I realized afterwards that during that I thought of nothing else. And you get that. I quote this guy, I forget the exact quote, it's a very funny quote, and it's one of these books, about this guy who's a regular schmo, I think an academic, who decides to become a boxer, and he talks about getting punched in the face, and the idea is how the same experience could change based on how you think of it. So he said, the first time you get punched in the face, you're terrified, oh my God, you want to run away. The second time, later on, another level, you get punched in the face, and you get angry, and you want to hit back. And then the third time, you start to love it. Now I'm in the thick of things. And I've never got to stage 3. I've kind of stuck in stage 1. But
Yeah, I'm not on stage 3.
martial arts in some way a technology that for everything we're talking about, it affords a wonderful example. It affords an example of the loss of self. It affords an example of also of mastery.
Right.
Where you're spending this hour doing it, but you're not spending this hour getting a massage or something. You're spending an hour doing stuff most people can't do, and that involves your focus and your attention. And it's also an example of something which is, it's a lot easier to stay at home and watch Netflix than to go and work out. And so you have to take that step, but then when you do, you find it rewarding.
It's funny, the context of pain, I always think about that with martial arts, because especially when I was training really hard, I was in my 20s. I remember I sort of banged my shin on the coffee table, and I was such a baby about it. And then my girlfriend's like, you come home from training like covered in black and blues. You've got this one little bruise on your shin, and that's going to bother you. But the difference was, that was an accident. I didn't want to get hurt with hitting the coffee table. But when you go into train, that's part of the deal. And it's a little bit of like a sort of red badge of courage. You feel like you've earned it.
That's a great concept. I don't mean any offense by this analogy, but there's a story I talk about a sexual masochist, and but all sorts of things you wouldn't believe. It's a sexual masochist who does all sorts of things to their body willingly that you wouldn't believe. Stubs his toe, and to his face, oh my God, I screaming like, this is the worst. And it's exactly the same conversation. Dude, you have yourself hung over a flaming pit. Yeah, but nobody chooses to stub their toe. And absent choice and absent choice, it just hurts.
That's funny.
So much of what we're talking about, and I think this applies to life more generally, even when you move it up a level, is that choosing to do something and performing at it and working through it makes it very different than stuff which just happens to you.
Right. It seems there's a real connection to the idea of control, right? This is a way to control pain, or at least, somewhat control it.
Martial arts being the obvious example, which is there's a world of difference between choosing to spar a role with somebody and then have somebody jump you. Even if you end up doing exactly the same thing. The second one is not only much more frightening, but it's this horrible invasion of you as a person. But if you choose to do it, it could be tons of fun.
Yeah. Do you still do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
I did it for about a year, and then I began to accumulate all sorts of injuries. And then one day I realized the truth was when there was a point where we were doing stuff standing up. Throws and everything. And,
all the judo stuff.
And the judo stuff. And on the ground, I don't mind being choked. Like, don't take that out of context and have that as a clip. Being choked.
There's a lot of choking going on.
There's a lot of choking, whatever.
Yeah.
But being picked up in the air and slammed to the ground was just a little bit much for my almost 60-year-old body. So now what I do, what I've started to do for the last 6 months actually, is I go to a gym around the corner and we do weight training for like 50 minutes. And it has some of the same things where it's really intense. A lot of it's out of my comfort zone, but it isn't as damaging to my body.
Oh, that's good. I know you have to. I mean, as you get older, I'm 46 now, and when I go boxing, I don't spar anymore. I just hit the bags really, because I don't want to get hit in the head.
You still do grappling things?
A little bit now and then, but I was never that good at it. I was really more of a stand-up guy. Like hitting and throwing. I did a lot of Hapkido has a lot of throws like judo. So I was pretty good at throwing and falling.
All I know about Hapkido is beautiful. It's beautiful to watch.
Yeah, it's very pretty. It's very pretty art. It's got sort of, I think it kind of borrows from everything. It's got some of those Aikido throws and some of the Jiu-Jitsu throws.
Plus Aikido.
Yeah, pretty much. It's sort of like a big multi-dimensional art.
Yeah. So again, it's interesting that it's not so hard to explain if you were doing these martial arts, because you have to defend yourself and you're part of the military or whatever. But if you do them in a large way, it's hugely rewarding. And I'm just fascinated. Why do we find something that rewarding? If a Martian came down, he would expect humans to be eating food and mating and building shelter. But instead, you're going to a gym and practicing choking each other. And that's kind of cool.
And this isn't something that's just a recent development. Is this kind of behavior something we've seen throughout history?
It's a good question. As far as we know, yes. As far as we know, some sort of benign masochism, violent sports, voluntary violent sports,
Yeah.
violent ritual, which you haven't talked about, religious ritual,
Mhm.
as far back as history goes. You know,
Wow.
one response I've gotten to the book, which isn't crazy, and who knows, might turn out to be right in some way, saying, look, it goes back to what you were saying before. You and I were affluent Westerners, we're old, everything is good with us. So there's a sort of ennui, a sort of boredom. So that's why people in our culture seek out scary movies and violent sex and and so on, because we don't get enough of difficulty and struggle in our everyday life. And that makes sense. But to the extent we know about people in other cultures, including cultures where they're not doing well, where they're struggling for food, they also like the same things. They also have difficult religious rituals and painful sports and so on. It seems to be a universal appetite, and as far back as it goes. And for the most part, we don't find it in other animals. There's some
Yeah,
exceptions.
that was my question.
Other animals, the one interesting exception is other animals will engage in like violent play, like play fighting. And play fighting is very interesting. It's an evolutionary trick to practice fighting without all of the risk. But,
Right.
But you know, so Paul Rozin, for instance, the guy who studied benign masochism, argues humans are the only animal that eats spicy foods. He did these studies in Mexico. Yeah, he did studies in Mexico. Mexican dogs avoid spicy foods. They'll eat them if they're really hungry, but for the most part, they'll go for mild food. Spice is pain, and humans invented the thing spice, which is pain, for all sorts of reasons, and now we seek it out.
Wow. And we never see animals. I guess you don't see them bouldering or running more than they need to, right? They're always conserving their energy.
They're conserving their energy. And again, there's some interesting exceptions, play being an interesting exception. But yeah, you don't find cases where animals do useless exertions of energy, useless exertions of thought. They're in some way, animals are more rational than we are. They do what you'd expect them to do.
Right.
And I think for a couple of reasons. I don't think they've picked up on the sort of tricks that we've learned. The trick that suffering can set the stage for greater pleasure. And then I don't think they have the sort of higher order goals that we're talking about, of mastery and self-esteem and meaning and all of that good stuff.
Well, I feel like we have, and maybe this is glorifying humans, but we almost have like sort of a setting tab, whereas other animals don't. We kind of like click on it and like, oh, this would be kind of interesting. Maybe we'll start playing with the settings as well. Other animals are just kind of playing the game.
Yes, I think it goes back to the first thing you asked about it being unconscious versus conscious, which is, as sort of conscious thinking beings, we can sort of look in front of us at the menu of activities and self-consciously choose what to do. And we could do this both in sort of a setting stage where we try to set our parameters, like a video game or something. We also just in individual choices, you know. Tonight I could, I don't know, I could hang out with my partner and go for a nice meal, but say I have a friend in the hospital, not really a friend, a family member I don't really get along, but in the hospital, I go visit my family member, and it's the right thing to do. So there's a balance between, do I want to do something which makes me happy, or do I want to do the right thing? And we make our choices. I get some money burning a hole in my pocket, I could buy something cool for myself, or I could give it to somebody in need. You know, we're always faced with these choices.
And some of it's linguistic too, right? Because we've got, you got words like happiness, and you've got satisfaction, contentment, meaning, and they're not perfectly delineated from each other.
Yeah, so the language is a mess here.
It is a mess.
And I try hard in the book to sort of make the claims and explore the ideas in ways that aren't particularly tied to any specific words. And the language being a mess makes the field of, say, positive psychology in general complicated. So you find culture A, people say they're more happy than culture B, but maybe they're just using the word happy in different ways, and you've got to struggle with that.
Do you find any in all the research you do and the research you cite, do you find any differences along sort of gender lines? Because I sometimes I think of
Yeah,
masculine like archetypes of
yeah,
being like stoically enduring misfortune and all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's such a good question. Much less than you would think.
Mhm.
So there's a stereotype that men like horror movies much more than women. But you do this, you ask 1,000 people waiting at horror
Mhm.
movies, and you get that difference. But it's a small difference. It's a difference.
Right.
It's a little bit different. I have a feeling that there's generational effects here too. That it used to be a big difference, and then now it sort of got together. If I would say, I would, if I had to guess, I would say women in some way may enjoy sadness. Well, the sort of experience of sadness, which you could feel
Mhm.
like from a song from Adele or something, while men may
Mhm.
enjoy the experience of anger. It would fit other differences you see.
Mhm.
But the cool thing when working on this, it's not like there aren't differences. I think everybody has this appetite we're talking about, but I think there's huge differences. You know, you like at some level activities that will involve getting you punched in the face. There are people who would find it incomprehensible. It's
Right.
not just that, oh, it's not for me. I don't get it at all.
Well, I mean, to be fair, the goal is not to get punched in the
Yes,
face. If I'm
yes,
any good, I'm not getting punched.
yes, but you're putting yourself in a situation
Right.
where it's a very viable possibility. While if your favorite sport is gin rummy, the odds go down.
Sure.
Um, People pick their poison. Some people
Mhm.
like really spicy foods. I do. My partner doesn't. My partner just doesn't don't put pepper on it. Nothing. Some people like BDSM. A lot of people like to
Mhm.
read about BDSM
Right.
and sadomasochism is like that. Others just absolutely not. So you get enormous differences. And the cool thing or the puzzle is nobody knows why they exist.
Mhm.
So I could give you every personality test in the world and know your gender, your age, your country of origin, all that stuff. And having known all that, I wouldn't be able to guess whether you like saunas or BDSM or
Mhm.
crossword puzzles or marathon running.
Really?
It's
So there's
fairly
no
unpredictable.
correlation. It's
It's
just,
fairly unpredictable.
yeah.
And we find this in other domains too. It's actually, to take something which might seem less complicated, less paradoxical, it's very hard to predict the foods people like.
Mm.
And a lot of these things you'd expect are genetic, but there's not much of a genetic connection when what the foods your parents like, your biological parents, and what you like. But there's also not something you could point to in experience.
Mhm.
So there's parts of things which, I mean, you talked about what my books have in common. And one thing is I sort of pursue things which I think are puzzling and mysterious and maybe make controversial claims. But another thing is I'm really interested in things that we just don't know that much about. And in my book, I try to make some progress on suffering and chosen suffering, but there's a lot we don't know.
Mhm.
We don't know much about cultural differences. We don't know much age differences. The neuroscience of it is very unclear. And I kind of like that.
Yeah. We also don't know anything about, it seems like we don't know much about animal intelligence, since we were talking about it before, like what the sort of how animal thinking actually works.
Yes, and there's and animal motivation, animal
Yeah.
consciousness is
Right.
such a cool question. I used to have this greyhound, and as I worked, I'd have a dog bed next to me, sitting dog bed.
Mhm.
And if I was there, I'd be bored out of my skull. But she didn't seem to be bored. She was just like this.
Yeah.
What is going through her head? Is it like a toaster? Nothing? Or is
It's just
she
off.
is
Damn.
it just
Yeah.
off,
Right.
and or is she like, planning to kill me or dreaming about adventures with other dogs, or I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. We have three dogs, and so every once in a while, one of the dogs, they're vastly different personalities. And one will
Yes,
walk in the room and
yes,
it'll look around, it'll survey the room as if thinking, and then decide something and either come in or just walk out. And
yes,
I'll think when it walks out, I think, what did it not find? Like, what
yes.
did it think? You know what? I've already taken a nap. I think I'm going to go in the other room. Like, it just, I don't know.
And how does that
I
click?
find it
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. No, I was once doing laundry and folding laundry and for some reason talking to my dog. Like just telling me, I got to talk to my dog. And all of a sudden, she just left, just shut out. What? What'd I say? You're bored? And
I've heard it.
My that's right. I live with you for years by now. Our relationship is, and I'll tell you what's even more interesting than animals. I'm a developmental psychologist. I would sell my freaking soul to know what it's like to be a baby.
Oh wow.
You know, to know, you're staring at a baby and what is going on in a baby's head. It's going to at some point turn into the sort of consciousness, personality that you and I are familiar with people, but maybe they don't start off that way. And what is it to be a baby? What is it even to be a 4-year-old? We all were one once, but
Yeah, but it all gets forgotten.
It all gets forgotten. Childhood amnesia.
Yeah.
And it's such a mystery.
That'd be a tough book to write.
It would be. It would be. I mean, my next book I'm working on is just a book all about psychology. And it's just and I have a chapter on consciousness. And I talk about some research here. And it's not that we're totally at a loss. So here's the cool point. Tell me if you find this interesting. I just wrote it down. But there's something there when people who study consciousness are very interested in the speed of thought. How fast do people think? And here's one way to see the speed of thought. You have a flickering light. And at some point, if it flickers fast enough, you don't see the individual flickers. It just turns white. You just see it.
Okay. Yeah.
Your mind's not fast enough to see the distinction.
The individual. Right.
Yeah. And I forget what the flicker rate is. Suppose it's 60 flickers per second. I'm not even sure it's close to it, but imagine that is. It turns out all different animals have different flicker rates, and you could explore this. And so,
really?
So the studies find, for instance, that if you took this method seriously, dogs think faster than humans by about 30%. And so what that might mean is, if that's true, that we move in slow motion for them.
Whoa. And that's pretty incredible.
That's kind of
cool.
A
great fact.
That's kind of cool. Or maybe not. Maybe we just can't use this method to find out. But I love the attempts to explore consciousness in all sorts of ways. There's the recent findings. It takes us in a different direction, but it's also very cool and very dramatic, where they've looked at people with who are in comas and who are and they asked the question, is there just person dead inside, or is there someone inside who's unable to move? So in some studies came out like 4 years ago, they put people in fMRI. And if you're in an fMRI machine and I ask you to think about your house versus actually think about playing tennis, very different parts of the brain are active. The house, it's, I think, the hippocampus, it's just spatial areas. The tennis, motor cortex, movements, the same thing that you're actually moving, light up, just thinking about batting around the ball. You tell these people, you say, look, and maybe there's nobody home here, maybe you're just dead, but just try this out. Yes is house. Think about your house if it's yes. Think about tennis if it's no. About half of the people they do this to, nothing happens. And then half, they talk back to you. You say, is your name so-and-so?
Right.
Yes. Is it do you have any brothers and sisters? No. And they answer questions.
That's amazing.
Suggesting that they're in there, conscious.
Right.
And they could communicate by thinking about different things.
But when people come out of it, do they recall these conversations?
As far as I know,
like
nobody's come
amnesia
out of it who's been in this study.
Okay.
And
yeah.
But the questions of consciousness and experiences of other people is just so interesting. But I think these things are to some extent tractable through scientific methods. I'm never going to know what it's like to be you, and you're never going to know what it's like to be me. But we can get some approximation.
I have a couple questions from members. I should have asked earlier. I got so caught up in our conversation, so hopefully they're not upset. One is from Rose Hayward, and she asks, how does emotional unavailability and or the mental state of denial impact one's ability to experience meaning and joy?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know much about the idea of emotional unavailability, but I do know that one of the things that people like, that is important to people, is what Mike Norton called emodiversity. Just going to be a weird term. But the idea here is that people don't just want to be happy. If you ask people and do it in all sorts of ways, what people want to feel is to some extent a range of emotions. They say a full life, and maybe even a full week, doesn't just involve happiness. It might involve other positive emotions like curiosity and gratitude, but also even negative emotions like anger and dissatisfaction. And I feel like the ability to sort of explore the full range of emotions requires something that often falls under the rubric of emotional intelligence, which is a capacity to contemplate your own emotions, to put them in different directions, and so on. And I would think that being shut off from emotions would make it hard for you to live a full life in that way. Make it hard for you to see the benefits of these different modes of experience.
Right. Sort of like you're just shielding yourself from the full effect.
Yeah.
A different question from Jolie Spar. You've mentioned people making up imaginary horrors to deal with real ones. This makes me wonder, do people who have experienced real horrors, tragic life events, seek fewer imaginary horrors?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I don't know the specific answer. Part of the problem is that people who have had horrible events, in some cases, would have some version or not of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that disorder involves imaginatively reliving horrible events. But I think that's a different thing than she's asking, which is she's asking a voluntary thing. And I would imagine that that in some way, there's the same sweet spot problem, where if something is valuable for you to know, valuable for you to experience, and can be experienced safely, you might seek it out in imagination. You might go to a horror movie. You might have a fantasy of some sort where you're imagining something. But if it's too close to the bone, too painful, you probably would want to avoid it.
Right.
When my kids were little, I couldn't see a movie involving the death of children.
I'm the same way.
I couldn't see Mystic River. I told you the plot point of the death of I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And so I think there's sort of a sweet spot phenomena that would suggest that if it's something you have experienced, if you experience an assault, you might just simply reasonably enough choose to veer away from imaginary depictions of assault, for instance.
Right. And I guess in that answer, it's kind of specific to the trauma you've experienced, right?
That's right. So does it cause a general lessening? Do people who have had traumatic experiences tend to avoid horror movies later on, even if the focus of the movie has nothing to do with their horror?
Right. It's a totally unrelated.
This is a really good question. I have no idea. I doubt it. I think our natural settings probably stay the same. There's this story in the book and then the movie Jarhead. It's about this guy. He goes to it's in the first Gulf War, and he's in the Middle East, and they're about to go to battle, and these kids are about to go to battle, but they're stuck in the barracks waiting and waiting and waiting. You know what they do? They watch war movies. They're watching Full Metal Jacket while they're waiting to go to war, and it suggests that these appetites don't shut off in some way.
Yeah, that's funny. Oh, I just remembered one thing. You know, I said I would mention something about Sisyphus.
Yeah.
The thing, I was recently rereading that myth a little while ago, and what I thought was interesting was I never understood why was he rolling the stone up over and over, because it just seems like at some point you would just lose motivation. I mean, why wouldn't you stop? And the reason was because at the top of the hill, if he gets it to stop, he can climb up and there's a hole, and he can climb out the hole and return to the earth and sort of return to the surface and live again. So the reason he's doing this whole thing is because he wants to live again, because he got there because he cheated death. So that's an important part of the story. I feel it's strangely overlooked.
That's a good part of the story. I actually didn't know that part. That's a good part.
Yeah, he was very clever.
I thought he was just condemned to do it in some vague way, but that's a better story.
So I have one last question. I know we're running out of time, and it was just essentially, I feel like when you go into a book, or I shouldn't speak for you, but I just from having talked to other writers, very often because you have questions about this idea and you want to sort of pursue it, and then your questions get answered as much as they can be answered, and then but sometimes there's something that really surprises you that you just didn't expect. Did you have that experience writing this book, or was everything kind of like within the reasonable realm of discovery?
I did have that experience. So, I wrote the book because I was just interested.
Mhm.
The guy who coined the term benign masculine, Paul Rosen, I went to a talk that he gave like 20 years ago and always stuck in my head. Why do we do
Mhm.
that? And I want to write the book exploring, here's like a cool puzzle. Why do we do it? I'm going to explore that and, whatever. People be interested or not interested and so on.
Mhm.
As I was writing the book, I came to realize talking to people, how big chosen suffering, how big a part of people's life is. I would, people would say, what are you working on a book? And I said, what are you working on? I'm writing a book. And they'd be put down nice. And they say, what are you writing about? And I would say, chosen suffering. And they said,
Mhm.
let me tell you something. And sometimes they would say, come on, keep this to yourself. But
Right.
and then they would tell me what they liked. And
Yeah.
I would just, and everybody seemed to have something. And
Huh.
that really surprised me. I thought a lot of people would just say, huh, weird. Okay, whatever. People are weird.
You thought maybe this is like a subset of the
Yeah.
like 30% of the population
That's right.
is
Maybe it's
this
just
is
me. I
something.
don't know. But I was sort of really struck by
Yeah.
how broad, and it encouraged me, because a lot of people would say, I do this, but I don't know why I do it.
Hmm.
Sometimes we know. Sometimes we know. Sometimes we say, oh, I do it for the contrast. Sometimes people do it for, we haven't talked about it, for social reasons. You know,
Hmm.
I when my teenage son, I was with a bunch of friends. I saw them with friends, and they're at a Japanese restaurant. They're saying who could eat the most wasabi. Well, I know
Right. Right.
why they're doing that, because their kids are
Yeah.
trying to show each other how tough they are. He knew. Everybody knew. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's mysterious. Most people who do are many people who engage in a sexual
Mhm.
masochism of various sorts just are drawn to it,
Mhm.
and they couldn't, like a lot of things, they can't tell you why they're doing it. And
Sure.
so that made it all the more interesting to me.
Yeah. And did you coming away from it, was there anything that you thought, oh, I think I'm going to change this about my life? Because yeah.
Yeah, so when I was younger, I read Csikszentmihalyi's book on flow, and it really had an influence on me, because I realized that
Mhm.
I was sort of thinking like a lot of people, well, what the good life is, I do work, but then the good life is I hang out and have fun and so on. And Csikszentmihalyi says, no, you got to do is get in these engaged, difficult activities, and it really affected my life. And I think like a decade went by, or two, one decade went by, and I kind of forgot about that.
Mhm.
And then doing this reminded me that, if I'm right, and a lot of other people are right, a good life involves difficulty and struggle. And then so I said, I'm going to try to get a bit more difficulty and struggle in my own life. So I joined the gym, for instance,
Mhm.
that where I'm doing the weight training.
Right.
I have set myself up some sort of rigorous and somewhat demanding schedule some part of my life. I know myself well enough that when I go on
Mhm.
vacation, my partner and I went to Aruba, which was really nice for a week. I bring my laptop and I try to
Mhm.
work for a couple of hours each morning. And I
Wow.
realized this is actually making me happier.
And
So,
you do feel happier. I mean, you
and I do
felt the
feel better.
difference.
Yeah, it seems to
Right.
work.
That's great. Yeah, I have a rule of thumb where I don't always follow it, but I try to, which is when I do an activity after I'm done, I just do a quick assessment, like how do I feel?
Yeah,
Just and there are certain things that I always feel better after I do them. And so, like I would say, exercise or write or certain but and so then when I'm deliberating or procrastinating,
that's
I'll
right.
think, "Do you remember last time?" You always feel good. Whereas if I watch TV for 2 hours, I
Yeah,
don't always feel good after that. I very
that's right.
often feel like I wish I hadn't have done that.
That's exactly right. For me, it's not me. It's often my partner. Like I say, I don't feel
Mhm.
like going to the gym. I'm just gonna skip it. And she says,
Yeah,
you always feel good when you come back
right.
after the gym.
It's great to have.
Or I
Yeah.
say, well, my afternoon, I'm gonna take a break, and imagine I'm gonna sit on the sofa and I'm gonna watch old game shows. And she said,
Mhm.
you're gonna be miserable when this is over. And then for some reason we often delude ourselves. I
Yeah.
think there's a kind of a, I don't know, false consciousness where there's things that are supposed to enjoy and
Mhm.
things we're not supposed to enjoy. Um, you know, again with the Csikszentmihalyi, but he says that everybody negotiates for vacation time, and
Mhm.
nobody says I want less vacation time. But weirdly, despite what people think, often people are happier at work than on vacation. And so it
Wow.
could surprise you. So this sort of, all this goes to say this assessment smart. And then if you keep, assessment's funny because common sense just fails us sometimes for these
It
things.
really does. We're terrible at predicting how we're going to feel.
Yeah, we're hedonic predicting failures.
Right. Well, on that note, I'll wrap it up. Paul, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating
It's
conversation.
been tons
Your
of
book
fun. And
is wonderful. I love it. I've read it a number of times now, and it's wonderful. So thank you so
thank you.
much.
And thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this.
Oh yeah, my
it means
pleasure.
a lot. I know if people are listening, I'm very receptive to people sending me emails or posting on Facebook or whatever to keep a conversation going.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we'll tell our members to post on the Facebook page.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good night.